We've solved our technical problem, and we're ready to roll with, got 3 bills, and we're going to start with Senator West on Senate Bill 7. And Senator West, you don't have any designated sponsor panelists, so we've got some witnesses signed up, but unless you want to bring anybody up, but I'll leave it up to you. But right now, you've got the time you need to present Senate Bill 7, and then we'll call up witnesses after that. We've got 2 in-person and 2 virtual, but why don't you start off?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I bring up Drew Perkins-Schmidt? This is a technical area, and it's not really an area that I spend much time in. So if there are technical questions, she's much better positioned to answer them.
She signed up in person, favorable, so we have her on the list, so that'll work fine. Okay.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be with the EEE Committee. I hope that resonates properly this afternoon to present Senate Bill 007. Let me emphasize at the outset that Senate Bill 007 has nothing whatsoever to do with James Bond. To the contrary, this very modest bill makes several technical revisions to last year's House Bill 318, which subsequently has been codified as Chapter 419. Both Chapter 419 and this bill deal with septic systems, not wastewater treatment plants. Further, both Chapter 419 and this bill focus on the transfer of the property containing the septic system, and more particularly, the qualifications of a person who inspects the septic system at the time the property is transferred. Under Chapter 419, a person who conducts such an inspection is required to hold a valid septic system property transfer license issued by the State Department of the Environment. Senate Bill 007 simply clarifies that the licensing requirements only apply to those persons conducting an inspection for the purpose of the property transfer, not to persons inspecting the septic system for any other reason. This bill also redirects the modest licensing fees to a new entity to be known as the On-Site Wastewater Professionals Fund. It further provides that any administrative penalties for violations of the law or regulations shall be paid into the Maryland Clean Water Fund. And finally, it slightly alters the composition of the State Board of On-Site Wastewater Professionals. The bill is supported by professionals in the septic industry, and it has no opposition to my knowledge. So under those circumstances, I appreciate the committee's consideration of Senate Bill 007, and I'll be happy to answer any questions the committee might have.
Okay, any questions for the sponsor, Senator West? Okay, seeing none, Miss Drew Schmidt-Perkins, sorry for messing that up a little bit. Are you here to testify in addition, or you're just here for backup for Senator West? Or, if so, you've got 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I am excitedly here in favor of 007, Senate Bill 007, where there's no opposition on a septic bill. This is very, very exciting. I'm going to remove my mask. It'll be easier to understand me. I'm representing today my client, Back River Precast, who's a septic dealer and provider, and also Team Septics, which is unofficial, unholy alliance between the septic industry and environmentalists and others. And we have been working collaboratively for a number of years to improve the septic industry and world. Matt Geckel, my client, is so busy out fixing septic systems that are failing at an alarming rate that he couldn't be here today. So thank you. House Bill 318 has worked to solve the long history of problems with septic systems resulting from bad design, installation, poor maintenance, the lack of information from homeowners on how to maintain them, and basically sets up a licensing board like there are for electricians or plumbers or hairdressers or accountants to make sure that this industry continues to evolve and improve. This bill here, as the sponsor mentioned, just has a series of technical fixes that we needed as it was worked to be implemented to make sure that things that we didn't get quite right in the original bill get straightened out. There is, however, one problem, and you're going to hear it later, so I'm going to try to address it a little bit early. You're going to hear that the professional engineers don't want to be included in this bill, And basically, they are people who are designing septic systems, and that is the very beginning of how a septic system is either going to work well or not. If you're involved in the septic industry, whether you're a pumper or a designer or an installer or a maintainer, you should be part of this board and not be exempted. We're going to have other testimony about why this is so important, but I just wanted to sort of give you a heads up that we are opposed to that amendment that's going to be offered coming up.
Okay, any questions for the witnesses? We've got Senator Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could the bill sponsor, and thank you for this bill, I just want to understand a little more about the funding of the Clean Water Fund with the penalties instead of, could you go through that component of the bill a little more, because it's redirecting the administrative penalties? Could you just focus on that
Sure, it's
section?
at the top of page 3 of the bill. The current language provides that any administrative penalty collected by the department under this subsection shall be paid into the separate account within the Bay Restoration Fund established by another section of the code. This bill merely takes that target destination of the money out and substitutes the main clean water fund established under section 9320 of this title. And Ms. Schmidt-Perkins might be able to provide more information as to why the substitution is desirable.
This was at the request of MDE as they worked to make sure that things were going into the appropriate funds. When we wrote this bill, we may not have gotten quite the right funds in place, names in it, so it's just correcting it to make sure things are going into the correct funds.
Technical.
A totally technical
Okay,
change
okay.
at the request of MDE and supported by them.
And there's nothing that won't be funded in the septic fund?
No,
Okay, great.
no,
Thank
no,
you.
no,
Great.
no. It really, total cleanup, no policy involved in this. This is a technical bill. It is an emergency bill.
Sure.
Because we have to get this fixed up so this board can get up and operating. So we are urging a quick,
I
favorable
understand now.
report.
Thank you so much.
Okay, any additional questions of either the sponsor or the witness? Senator Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How long does it take to get this property transfer license?
The property transfer license was actually done in a previous bill, not House
Uh-oh.
Bill 3, but it just set up much better standards for who is a property transfer inspector, because previously we had people going out, and what we sort of called the stomp, stomp, sniff, sniff test, when somebody was buying a house and they wanted to see if the septic system was operating. They were not doing full inspections. And then later on, this new homeowner was having, things exploding back into their basements or, other problems. And it turned out that the inspector hadn't actually done a competent inspection. And so that bill set up a better inspection training and licensing. And then the next year, when we came in with the full board of licensing, we've rolled them into that one board. And so they'll be all part of that on-site wastewater licensing board.
So this license is akin to the professional engineering license that folks take?
So it would be similar, but professional engineers do not often qualify on septics at all. So there's many people who are involved in the septic industry. There are pumpers, there are designers, there are installers, there are the property transfer inspectors. And this is just a licensing board involving all of them to make sure there's minimal standards, testing, and accountability. So if somebody is not a good actor, there's accountability on that person, which has all been lacking to date.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any additional questions? These two witnesses? Okay, thank you, Senator West, for the bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We do have two virtual witnesses signed up, one favorable with an amendment. We're going to start with our favorable witness. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed Emily Ransom is here in person. I'm sorry, Ms. Ransom, you're here in person. Then we'll go to our two virtual witnesses.
All right. Good afternoon, members of the committee. I am Emily Ranson with Clean Water Action, here in support of Senate Bill 7. So House Bill 318, for which this is a technical fix bill, it took 4 years to pass that with multiple public hearings. And the intent throughout it was always clear that designers needed to be included because we were encountering problems with all steps of the septic process. There were systems being designed poorly, then they were being installed poorly, and then they were being inspected poorly. And so House Bill 318 was really a comprehensive look at accountability for this industry. Also, technology changes. I have talked many, many times to this committee, and for those of you who may be new to septic systems, a septic system is not just a box in the backyard that treats waste. It has a lot of sensitive features about it. Things like soil are incredibly important for its effectiveness at treating waste. And while we oftentimes joke that it's a very small wastewater treatment plant in your backyard, it's not really. It's a different process. So this is one of the things that, one of the reasons why we see this need for updated training that's specific to septic systems to respond to changing technologies, as well as our changing weather patterns, changing drainage patterns, all of that. So we urge a favorable report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Ms. Ranson? Okay, seeing none, we're going to now move to the virtual witnesses. We're going to start with Mr. Edward Harrison, who signed up favorable. We're going to cue him up, and hopefully we're going to see him in a minute.
I'm trying. My camera won't turn on.
Okay, well, we can hear you. If we can't get you on video.
There
okay,
you go.
There you
Somebody
go.
blocked me.
Okay, well, you're on the clock starting now, 2.5 minutes, Mr. Harrison.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Eddie Harrison. I am the legislative liaison for the Maryland On-Site Wastewater Professional Association, or MALPA. We are in support of SB 07. MALPA participated in discussions with Team Septic and the Maryland Department of Environment this past summer and concur these changes are necessary. I will refer to my written testimony on any further details on that. MALPA has become aware of a concern of an amendment that has been proposed by the Maryland Society of Professional Engineers. This bill is for errors and omission. This bill is not to alter the intent of the previous legislation. Adding this amendment will alter the intent of the previous legislation. MALPA considers having licensed designers, which include architects, land surveyors, landscape architects, and yes, professional engineers. Plan reviewers as well, to be trained in the science, nuances, mechanics, Maryland policies, and COMAR regulations of on-site wastewater is our priority. The on-site industry has been plagued with poor designs coming from all current licensed designers. The mentality is, it's just a septic, how hard could it be? Due to the evolution over the past 25 years, on-site wastewater systems are far more complex than just a septic system. A good on-site wastewater system starts with a good design. Considerations for good design include, but not limited to, soil composition, location as it relates to nearby obstructions and prohibitions, wells, waterways, landscape position, etc. If the system requires automation, many hydraulic considerations need to be made, along with science of treatment and dispersal. Our groundwater relies on this. Property owners deserve a system that will give them a long, dependable lifespan. Regulators from state and county agencies have been the most vocal supporters of educating the professional designers. On-site wastewater systems are not just septic systems. Municipal plants and other large-scale treatment facilities utilize aggressive treatment practices, where on-site systems utilize passive and natural processes to process the waste and dispersal of effluent. Everyone in the on-site industry should be licensed and educated. It is counterproductive to exempt these designers from accountability when the guy that just pumps the septic tank needs the oversight of the upcoming board. We urge for a favorable report on HB 07 with no amendments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Any questions for Mr. Harrison? Okay, seeing none, we will now turn to our favorable with an amendment from the Maryland Society of Professional Engineers, Tory Pierce. Mr. Pierce, we do see you, and you've signed up again favorable with an amendment, and you've got 2.5 minutes, so you can start now. You're on the clock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the EEE Committee members. My name is Tory Pierce. I'm I'm at 5 South Main Street, Bel Air, Maryland. I am here representing the Maryland Society of Professional Engineers and our engineering consulting firm, Frederick Ward Associates. I'm here speaking today because one of our licensed engineers came to me right before Christmas last year asking for a $150 check to obtain another license to be able to design a septic system. And I scratched my head and I said, well, isn't designing septic part of what we do as professional engineers? And of course it is. And so I asked him to reach back out to MDE and confirm that that was in fact a requirement, which we did. We were told we had to do that. And I thought that was out of line and overkill as far as licensing is required. So I reached out to our colleagues at the society and our colleagues at the Maryland Engineers Registration Board. Nobody was aware of the legislation and the requirement to get this additional license. But sure enough, it is written in the statute that was passed last year. So just want to add a few points in addition to the written testimony. As licensed professional engineers, we are required by law to be the designers of sewer systems and plumbing systems inside buildings and for utilities. We're also required to be the designers for sewage treatment plants. And in all of these efforts, we're not required to obtain any additional licensing or certifications. And the design of a septic system is very similar to the design, contrary to what was said, very similar to the design of a sewage treatment plant. You have primary treatment in a tank, you have tertiary or secondary treatment in a drain field. And it is based on design flows, based on land use and soil conditions as far as the discharge is concerned. So we are trained. We do have to do continuing education. We are only allowed to practice in the field where we're experts. And so our professional engineering license, is essentially a license to install or to design septic systems as well. So in that respect, if we don't have to get an additional license for a sewage treatment plant design, I'm not sure why we would have to do the same for a septic system. But on a sidebar, we're in support of if the legislator wants to create this board, which they actually have by law, we'd like to be a part of it. So we're happy to participate in the process, and we're happy to have a strong presence on the board. So with that, we'd like the created board to reach out to the engineering community to participate.
Okay, well, thank you for your testimony. Any questions for Mr. Pierce? Okay, seeing none, well, that concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 7. We're going to next, I'm sorry.
Am I signed up?
I don't have you signed up.
That's all right. I'm not signed up. I thought I signed up, but
Okay.
I'm having trouble with my
Well,
system getting it signed up.
you can submit some written testimony if that's okay. Okay.
I
So we're next going to turn to Senate Bill 92. Senator Lamb, if you want to come up here, you've got two sponsor panelists signed up favorable. I'll call them up as well in person, Ryan Fredrickson and Mark Sutherland. So Senator Lamb, we're here on Senate Bill 92, and you've got unlimited time to present your bill, and then we'll turn to your two witnesses.
So good afternoon, members of the committee, Chair Feldman. It's great to be back before Education, Energy, and the Environment. I'm here to present Senate Bill 92. And for the record, Clarence Lamb, Senator in District 12. The primary goal of this bill is to help move the state forward on its goals of reducing energy use and the environmental impact of our buildings. Senate Bill 92 was introduced as a result of the proliferation of glass buildings, and in particular, buildings constructed of glass, which are more difficult to cool and are also more costly to maintain, resulting in increased greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, this not only negatively impacts energy conservation efforts, but also costs the state more money, contributes to climate change, biodiversity loss, and negatively impacts human health. This bill would ensure that new or significantly renovated buildings use construction and design standards that reduce energy loss through windows as well as excessive lighting when buildings are not in use. Under this bill, any building that is under state ownership is required to meet standards that would reduce energy consumption through these requirements. As part of these standards, interior and exterior lighting must be appropriately shielded and minimized between midnight and dawn each day unless otherwise documented as necessary. as well as achieving our energy conservation goals, this bill will help reduce the likelihood of injury or death to migratory birds, which play a crucial role in pest control and are an important driver for tourism in our state, as well as a critical component of biodiversity. Maryland has a long history of tourism and economic benefit related to waterfowl hunting in the state. There is testimony in the folder from a UMBC professor and waterfowl hunter discussing how this is a common sense solution to ensure a stable waterfowl population for future generations. In order to ensure that this bill is implemented in an affordable way, we have included language to only require the state to follow the requirements of this bill, quote, to the extent practicable and within budgetary constraints. So we do not foresee significant costs related to this bill, and I believe that's reflected in the fiscal note because it will only be requiring DGS to balance the environmental impacts of our buildings against the budgetary needs of other building priorities. There is testimony from the American Institute of Architects that discusses how this bill could save energy and costs on new buildings, but would only have would have significant energy savings costs on new buildings, but would only have moderate increases in costs in building construction renovations. There also in your packet is testimony from multiple organizations that support this bill, which you can reference there. And this bill overall, we believe, helps reduce energy costs in our state buildings, as well as the overall environmental impact of our buildings. And it is also one where we see support from hunters, environmentalists, and architects alike. And we hope to ask for a favorable report from this committee. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Senator Lamb, the sponsor? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to next to the two witnesses, each of whom have 2.5 minutes. We're going to start with Ryan Fredrickson. Mr. Fredrickson, you've got, again, 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and Vice Chair Kagan. Good to see you as well. And to the members of the committee, my name is Ryan Fredrickson, Vice President of Government Affairs at the National Aquarium, and it's good to be back here before the committee. We are here to request a favorable report for SB 92. Combating climate change and saving wildlife and habitats are two of our 3 strategic conservation priorities. This bill aligns with both of those goals by helping state buildings conserve energy and implement industry-recognized standards for reducing fatal bird strikes. The state of Maryland lies within a major migratory pathway for birds, putting birds at risk of colliding with man-made surfaces, such as glass, and often resulting in their death. It is estimated that window strikes are a leading cause of population decline for birds, second only to habitat loss. In recent years, the National Aquarium has covered over 3,000 square feet of existing glass surfaces with bird-safe dot patterns. These dot patterns make the glass visible to birds and have reduced strikes on our buildings. We also recently completed a project, as you may be aware, to replace all 684 glass panes of our iconic rainforest glass pyramid. Each pane was replaced with a bird-safe etched glass, which is visible to birds and increases energy efficiency by diffusing sunlight. So this method of incorporating the bird-safe glass into the construction process is a cost-effective way to both reduce bird strikes and conserve energy, and that is the type of process that we would see implemented on state buildings if this bill were adopted. So our experience shows that standards outlined in this bill are highly effective and have multiple benefits. So for those reasons and more, we respectfully urge the committee to issue a favorable report, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, why don't we go to Mr. Sutherland? Why don't you testify? You've got 2.5 minutes, then we'll open it up to questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair, and members of the committee. I'm Mark Sutherland with Safe Skies, Maryland. Appreciate the opportunity to speak about what I think is a very important but also common sense bill. As the Senator has already mentioned and Ryan have mentioned, that this will require state buildings going forward to be sustainable in both energy conservation and wildlife protection. This is important because the 2 greatest threats to humanity, according to the United Nations, are climate change and biodiversity loss. So we make our attempt to affect that with this bill. The specifics of those are that buildings that are more than 40% glass lose energy, emit more greenhouse gas emissions, are not sustainable going forward, and lose money. They also kill 1 billion birds a year, which is one of the main reasons why we have 29% fewer birds in the United States than we did in 1970. The good news is, with those dire facts, is that we have a ready-made solution. The scientists and builders have worked together, specifically the American Bird Conservancy and the Green Building Council, to develop LEED Innovation Credit, which is a standard that meets these conditions and provides a sustainable design in facades and lighting, as been previously mentioned. And by doing so, you will reduce up to 25% the energy for buildings, and you will reduce bird mortality by 90% or more. So it's a win-win. It's a simple, common-sense solution that's been developed already and codified in those LEED standards, and it's being implemented now. Over the last 15 years, it's been passed in various cities around the United States, Canada, even worldwide. In 2020, our own Howard County passed a bill. New York City did it the same year. Last year, the state of Illinois passed the bill. And just on January 26th, the mayor of D.C. signed a bill that was unanimously passed by the city council there. So the time is now for Maryland to do this and be a leader in sustainable design going forward. So I please respectfully request your favorable report on SB 92.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your testimony. Any questions for any of the witnesses, the sponsor or the two witnesses? Senator Simonaire.
Thank you. Senator Lamb, you always attract a crowd. It's nice to have you back.
Good to be back.
I was just looking through the bill real quickly, and you made a case why this is so compelling to do. And I was looking at the exemptions that it does not apply, and it says it doesn't apply in the capital budget as a grant to nonprofit organizations. Why are we exempting nonprofits if this is such a great idea?
So I think the thought here is that sometimes these nonprofit organizations are going through capital projects that are very small. You'll notice that the dollar amount didn't apply to paragraph 3 there, and so their resources may be very limited. So, I think we're trying to draw a threshold where these are significant building projects. These are building projects that are large, that have a large footprint as well, that are going through major renovations or new constructions. And oftentimes that's not what nonprofits are going through. They don't usually own the buildings, they don't usually own their commercial space, and they're not going through these large renovations. Oftentimes they just don't have the resources to do that.
So would you be opening to put a dollar threshold on opposed to a complete blanket waiver?
We could think about it. I think so the challenge there is that there are a lot of nonprofits of different sizes, right? And so some nonprofits are larger, some nonprofits are smaller. I think by putting a dollar threshold there, you're really drawing kind of a hard line, and oftentimes these nonprofits will have special status anyway. That's why they are nonprofits, right? And so I'm not sure. I mean, if there are suggestions, I'm open to kind of hearing from that, but I think the nonprofits, we're really just trying to hold harmless because they're really doing work for the public good, and oftentimes are stretched when it comes to resources to be able to do things, and that would be another imposition that could be tough for them.
I would say, counter that, say state government tries to do good for the people, and we're stretched with money as well. But we can talk offline. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, any additional questions for the panel? Okay, thank you, Senator Lamb. That concludes the bill hearing on Senate Bill 92, which brings us to our third and final bill, which does have some more witnesses than the first two bills. Is Senator Hedelman in the House yet? Oh, there she is, okay. So Senator Hedelman, why don't you come up? You've got 4 witnesses signed up as part of your sponsor panel, and I'm going to call them up in the following sequence. Eric Galley, Diana Ignor, Stephen Lassie, and finally Graham Peasley. Those 4 witnesses are, as you've designated, as your sponsor panelists. And we are on Senate Bill 158 and 158. And so, Senator Hedelman, you can lead off. You've got unlimited time, and then we'll go to the sponsor panelists after that.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members of EEE. I'm very happy to be here. my first bill hearing before this newly named and newly led committee, so I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon. Senate Bill 158 is a bill about PFAS. PFAS are perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and these are called forever chemicals. And they're called that because there's no known safe way to dispose of them, and they don't break down in the environment, so they're around for a really, really long time. They're in our air, our water, our earth, and in our bodies. There have been over 1,400 studies on PFAS, and there's evidence that they're linked to causing cancer, liver malfunction, low birth weight, hormone changes, thyroid disease, and immune deficiencies, meaning they mess with the body's ability to receive proper vaccination adherence. PFAS are all around us, but this bill focuses on PFAS in pesticides. If you recall last year, this committee and the entire General Assembly recognized the danger in PFAS in firefighting foam, rugs and carpets, and in food packaging, and we banned it. What we're trying to do in this bill is the next natural step. We know that there are PFAS that are used in in the pesticides used in mosquito spray that is ubiquitous around us. And it's used by the Department of Agriculture as well as numerous other public and private entities that spray. And we know they're in other pesticides that are being used on our crops and that eventually get into our beloved Chesapeake Bay and other tributaries. In fact, the Maryland Department of the Environment issued an advisory in October of 2021 advising against eating 3 different kinds of fish in Piscataway Creek in Prince George's County. A biologist from the U.S. Geological Survey said in a letter to me recently regarding that fish advisory, quote, "In an attempt to better understand sources, we combine data from all years, seasons, and sites to evaluate land use attributes. PFOS and total PFAS were positively correlated with total pesticide application in the immediate catchment area, and the number of EPA toxic release facilities in the upstream catchment. So, in addition to running into our waterways and making our fish sick and deformed, pesticides with PFAS are also being used on our crops. And our crops, like vegetables, suck up PFAS, and we eat them, and they get into our bodies. And so it goes. One of the particular difficulties in PFAS use in mosquito spray and other pesticides is that we can't get away from them. Unlike firefighting foam or certain carpets and rugs, we can't avoid them because we exist in the world where they're being sprayed. So what does this bill do to address the issue? It's pretty straightforward. It says that if a manufacturer wants to register a pesticide for use, and they do an annual registration process right now, against mosquitoes in Maryland, they have to get it tested and demonstrate to the Maryland Department of Agriculture that it's PFAS-free by January 1, 2024. And it says that any pesticide being used in Maryland generally after January 2026 needs to demonstrate that it's also PFAS-free. And we say explicitly that the Department of Agriculture is under no obligation to do this testing themselves. You're going to hear from scientists, some of whom are here, about the dangers of PFAS, and you're also going to hear a lot of discussion about the testing of pesticides and whether it's actually possible to test them for PFAS using the criteria and options that we outline in the bill. We firmly believe the answer to this is yes. These tests are being done now, and we have a proposal from a world-renowned lab nearby to do exactly what we're asking others to do in this bill. And we have many labs in this state. In fact, Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland that have the equipment and do this kind of testing. This isn't an onerous request, and it's not even particularly expensive. It is, however, the absolutely right thing to do to protect our air, to protect our water, to protect our earth, to protect our food supply, and most importantly, our citizens from the very real harm of these forever chemicals. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Senator Hedelman. And, before we go to the panel, any questions for the sponsor? Okay, seeing none, we're going to go next to Mr. Galley, Eric Galley. Mr. Galley, you've got 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee, and thank you to my sponsor who did such a great job. Half of my testimony doesn't even need to be done anymore. And I'm going to skip right down to the part where I tell you that this is my 31st year presenting public health and environmental proposals to the Maryland General Assembly. Thank you very much. And every single time I do that, the opposition comes in and says pretty much the same thing. The science isn't ready. Let's wait for the feds to do it. The federal government will do it better. We should just hold off. Well, I'm thankful that you didn't heed that advice on tobacco and smoking, because the FDA is still mulling what to do with vaping and tobacco and smoking. I'm thankful you didn't wait for the federal government to declare a climate emergency, and you were working it on years before the federal government finally, about a year ago, declared it to be a climate emergency. So that's why you're here. You all to protect Marylanders and take care of Marylanders. And what we need here is a Maryland-specific solution. Maine decided that they shouldn't wait for the EPA, that they should do a state-specific solution. So we would ask you today to listen to the scientists that we've brought for you, to talk about how the science is ready and we're ready to go, and to do what you have always done to protect Marylanders. So thank you very much. I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, we'll go through the whole panel, then we'll open it up for questions. Senator Hedelman, did you have a sequence from this point forward as to who you wanted to go next up in your scientist panel here? Tell us your name.
My name is Graham Peasley, and I'm whom they've elected to go first, if you don't mind.
Okay, you're up, Mr. Peasley. You've got 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here, my name is Graham Peasley, I'm a professor at the University of Notre Dame, and I am a PFAS expert. I measure them, I measure their fate and transport in the environment, and I am aware of how to measure them analytically. I developed new techniques for measuring them. Yeah, I've got 30 to 25 papers on PFAS and 320 overall, 230 overall. But before the credentials are all there. I am a respected scientist, but I'm really here because I can talk to people, and I have funding from Department of Defense, US EPA, USGS, and Water Resource Foundation currently to work on PFAS. It is a huge problem, perhaps the largest the US has ever faced. They are a class of chemicals, not just one, but there's 12,000 known chemicals in this class. There's no way we can regulate them one by one. We have to treat it as a class, even though they don't want to be. They're all man-made, and they share one unique property. They last forever. This is what you're reading in the newspapers as the forever chemical. And they pile up in your body, and that's bad news. Many of them are bioaccumulative. All of them are persistent. Many of them are bioaccumulative, which means that they get in the water, they get into the plants, they get into the meat, they get into the fish, and they get into the eggs, and they bioaccumulate in our bodies. They are also toxic. Not all of them have been studied, but those that have all shown toxic properties. And some of them are extremely toxic, hence the latest health advisory limits from the EPA, which are in the 0.02 parts per trillion, a number so unfathomably small we can't even measure that low, but we can show that it has effects on human health at that level. Not all of them are toxic, but most of them haven't been measured yet. So the last place you want a forever chemical is in your environment or entering into the food supply of your constituents. This is why I'm here to support the bill. I have 2 points to make. One is can you measure these things, and is it an undue burden to measure them? And the answer is absolutely you can measure them. We're doing it now. Every commercial laboratory in the state can already measure these things. The reason that there's no insecticide or pesticide specific method is because there's never been developed for such a niche application. It will never be. At the moment, we dilute them 1,000-fold, and then they're water. And you treat them as drinking water samples, and they're analyzed perfectly easily by every lab in the state that has a qualified lab. In my opinion, that's a no-brainer. And then lastly, these are a recent discovery. I'll just go a couple seconds late. This is a recent discovery. I only knew a year ago that they started showing pesticides, and Dr. Lassie will speak to that point. And I'd like to urge you to say this is one where you can do the right thing and protect the environment and protect both the agricultural community and the citizenry. The ag community wants the pesticides, but they don't want the PFAS. And this is an important distinction. We're only going after the PFAS. And I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Which of the two of you want to go next? Okay, we're going to go to you, Mr. Peasley.
Yep.
Mr. Peasley.
No,
hello. Yes.
I'm Dr. Stephen Lassay.
I'm sorry.
I have a PhD in environmental toxicology from Texas Tech University. The primary focus of my research for 10 years has been PFAS exposure, particularly through the consumption of food and drink. EPA scientists have estimated that 98% of the average American's exposure to PFAS is through their mouth. Many PFAS have incredibly long biological half-lives, some as high as 10 plus years, making any exposure to these chemicals a lifelong ordeal. I recently published a peer-reviewed study where I found PFAS concentrations, PFOS in particular, in 6 out of 10 tested insecticides, many of which are still widely used in Maryland and the rest of the United States. The PFOS was not a listed component of the products. So how did it get there? Is it a proprietary inert ingredient? Contamination through manufacturing? Regardless of how the PFOS got into the insecticides, it will end up on anything it's applied to, including our food. Well, I made this discovery at a USDA crop genetics research center, so unsurprisingly, they grow crops there. So I tested the crops. The EPA's current interim health advisory level for PFOS in drinking water is 0.02 parts per trillion, or PPT. So corn, green beans, and peanuts had PFOS concentrations of 320 ppt, 430 ppt, and 40 ppt. I tried sampling nearby fields to find PFAS-free controls. I couldn't find any. This suggests that PFAS contamination I observed could be pervasive and impact several different crops. A single serving of the beans I tested would result in a PFAS exposure equivalent to consuming 1,400 years of water at the EPA's interim health advisory level. I know this number sounds ridiculous, 1,400 years of exposure for 1 cup of beans, but the interim health advisory level set up by the EPA was done under the idea that no exposure to PFAS and PFOA is really safe over a lifetime. I also tested the soil at the site and found concerning concentrations of several PFAS. This PFAS in the soil will continue to pose consumptive risk through plant uptake essentially indefinitely. Reduction of the sources of PFAS in our food system through SB 158's protection from PFAS and pesticides will ultimately reduce human exposure to PFAS. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Doctor. And I assume Ms. Agnor, that's you, and you've got 2.5 minutes, and that'll, and then we'll take some questions.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Diana Aigner. I'm a biologist, toxicologist, and I'm a retired EPA scientist that worked in the Office of Pesticides and also the Office of Water. I'm currently working with the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Project with the Maryland Pesticide Education Network. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's happening with fish with these perfluorinates. So we know that it actually damages their immune system, their thyroid, their reproduction, and you've heard about it going up the food chain. Definitely does that with fish. Invertebrates, a small fish eats them, a big fish eats them, and then we eventually eat them. So that's biomagnification, bioaccumulation. But I really wanted to talk about what's happening in Maryland, and this is not a comprehensive list. It's just give you some ideas. So we know a lot of our drinking water comes from surface water, and the Water Keepers Alliance actually went out and sampled 12 locations in Maryland, and all of the samples were above that 0.01 ppt drinking water value for PFOS, which is one of the #1 perfluorinated chemicals. Also, Maryland Department of the Environment went ahead and did fish sampling and had such high concentrations in Piscataway Creek in Prince George's County that they actually put out a fish advisory. USGS also went and did collections, really high concentrations in fish again. Actually, it's almost like 1,000,000 times what we're seeing and with this drinking water number of 0.01. The Delaware River Basin also samples, seeing one fillet, I love this one fillet is equal to drinking water for over like 300,000 years. So we don't have a lot of complete pesticide information. The 2002 Maryland Pesticide Survey only got 6% of the farms of the 12,000 farms, and they estimated 5 million pounds of use. So if you kind of extrapolate, that's about 85 million pounds used, but we don't know which one of them contain PFAS because it's not clear in the labels that the farmers are using. So I believe our residents deserve this. We deserve to see action to remove the PFAS-containing pesticides. We have pesticides that work that don't contain PFAS, and we're adding something that's a forever chemical if we continue doing this. So thank you, and I'm open to any questions you have.
Okay, questions for the entire panel? We're going to start with Senator Gallion, then we'll go to Senator Hester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple questions to the bill sponsor, whoever you may delegate. It's my understanding as part of registration, Maryland requires the submission of confidential statements of formulation, which would include information on whether the product has PFAS. So why do we need a separate affidavit when the information is already provided to the state?
We are saying that if it has PFAS, that you can't sell it in the state or use it in the state. So that's different from what is currently being required and asked.
And the other question would be, do you think does Maryland have the infrastructure to conduct this level of testing for all the pesticides registered in the state, which I believe to be over 12,000?
Absolutely. We are asking manufacturers to do this. So we believe that there is the lab capacity both in-state and surrounding areas for the manufacturers to be able to do this. We're not putting any further burden on our state agencies to do so. We're asking the folks who want to use it and are manufacturing it before you're allowed to do that in this state, that you attest that they don't have PFAS.
Okay, Senator Hester.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know who on the panel can answer this, but we've looked at PFAS, which is a horrible chemical, for several years now. My question is, how do we know that when you're talking about like the food that we eat and the water that we drink, that how much of that is coming from agriculture versus everything else? And how much is coming from the state of Maryland versus, the states that watershed flows into our community?
I would defer to our scientists on that. Thank you for the question.
That's actually an excellent, Senator, excellent question. It won't be the only source of your PFAS. You are probably, the drinking water advisory is there because we all drink water. Not everybody eats fish. Not everybody will eat the contaminated fish. So the question is, can you be sure that this will solve any problems in human health consumption? No, but it is an easy one to target because it's not necessary. You need drinking water, and you cannot stop from drinking water. You don't need insecticides or pesticides with PFAS. There's at least half of them don't have PFAS right now and can be sold and don't need any further testing. They can do a one-time test and say, look, we've never used it, it's not there. And so this is a no-brainer in the sense you don't have to do additional testing. The state will, of course, spot check, but they're already doing spot checks, and they'll use commercial labs that are available. It's not a specialty technique to do drinking water. They just dilute it. It's called a dilute and shoot, and it goes, and you can do this test to confirm that there are no PFAS occasionally, and the industry should do it before they even sell the product. And half the industries don't know if they use it or not. They just buy a surfactant. They don't know what's in the surfactant. And the labeling, I'll go to the other senator's question, the labeling is not complete. The manufacturers themselves don't even know. And so this is doing a service to both the industry that sells the insecticide and the ag users that are actually depending upon this product. You want the product to be not contaminated, and that's why it's designed that way. Does it solve all our PFAS issues? Absolutely not. But your Senate has already done a marvelous job in restricting its use in so many other products. This is one that we missed because it wasn't known last year. It's on paper, it came out last year, and it's you put it directly into the watershed.
Can I want to address the label issue because I think people aren't really clear. So when the pesticide companies give you a label, it has what the active ingredient is, like malathion, and then it has a huge percentage that's inert, that's never really defined. So people don't know what's in the inerts. Even me working in pesticide programs, and I did risk assessments, I never knew what those inerts were necessarily. I worked there 2002 to 2006, then I switched to Office of Water, but you would never know. So I think we just don't know with these pesticides that are being used what has PFAS and what doesn't. That's why it's important. And you can use pesticides that don't have PFAS. So we already know that this is everywhere. And why continue using PFAS pesticides when we know what it does to our bodies and all these organisms' bodies also? So that's just my deal with the label thing, because it's unclear about the labels. So a farmer would not know with the
Okay.
labels.
Do you have a follow-up, Senator Hester?
I did. I just wondered if you could get back to our committee with examples of other states that have done this and how they're doing their testing. And then, Mr. Chair, I understand the Department of Agriculture is here, and at the appropriate time, could we ask them a question?
Well, I'm going to call, we have one gentleman from Agriculture who signed up in person, informational, so I was going to call him up next before we went to favorable, unfavorable, so he's going to be up next. Vice Chair Kagan, you had a question?
I'm going to toss this to Senator Hedelman or anyone on the panel. I think you all have made the great case that PFAS is terrible and it's a forever chemical, but none of you, unless I missed it, none of you have talked, for those who are listening at home and are hearing about this, learning about this for the first time. What makes it so terrible? What does it do to our body after we eat the fish and eat the everything else that has all this stuff? So I defer to my colleague first, or anyone on the panel.
Thank you, and I will, if it's okay, I mentioned in my testimony the detrimental health effects it has. So in terms of liver disease and thyroid and reticence, it hampers our ability to, our immune system in terms of vaccine acceptance, reproductive health, and it's passed down in, for nursing through milk, cancer. I mean, I'm probably missing some, but those are pretty big and horrible.
That I missed those, but I didn't hear
No.
any of the scientists talk
Yeah.
about those. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, that's a well-established list. She got it right. Those are all very serious health effects.
Okay, any additional questions for this panel before we move on? Okay, thank you, Senator Hedelman. Thank you to the panel for your testimony. As I mentioned, I am going to bring up Tom Phillips. Mr. Phillips from the Maryland Department of Agriculture signed up for information purposes only, so it's a good opportunity to ask any questions of our department. So, Mr. Phillips, when you come up here, I don't know if you have some prepared remarks, or you're just here to answer some questions from the committee, or?
As far as I know, I'm just here to answer questions.
Okay, why don't you have a seat now? I know Senator Hester indicated right off the bat she did have a question, so we'll turn it over to her.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess I was just trying to figure out the testing and how that would work. I mean, quite a bit of this is about, if it's less than 100 parts per trillion, it gets tested one way. If it's less than 10 parts per billion, it's another way. What is actually the capacity for testing in the state of Maryland?
But to be honest, I haven't surveyed the labs. I've called Eurofins because I've got friends that are the chief science officer. I've known him for like 17 years. I've talked to Patel, who is a renowned environmental lab that has a lot of DOD and other contracts. And I've also talked to Pace Analytical, who's also countrywide. And they're saying, they don't have a method for it. And as far as capacity, I don't know. I have 12,526 pesticides registered on average for the last 13 fiscal years. And that's a lot of samples. And if we have to do that yearly, that's going to be a lot, for, even if we spread it out for labs. But a lot of the big major players may not farm it out. They may do that themselves.
Understand. So as the legislation is written, is it the test is performed by a laboratory, but is it the manufacturer that has to do the test?
Well, it talks
and are you
about-
talking? The labs that you're talking to, are those?
It talks about
So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is if it's hard to get these tests, are we just going to be cutting off, like instantaneously cutting off any chemical that may have this in the Because we may need a transition process or something.
Well, when this bill popped up, I emailed all my registrants, which are, the people that register the pesticide products, which is about 935. But there's also manufacturers that aren't registrants. And so it was about 1,155 emails I sent out. And some of those companies are small businesses. They've got less than $30,000 to $40,000 in sales in the state of Maryland. And they've pretty much said, no matter what it would cost, they're not going to register anymore. So the bill talks about, labs that are identified as capable of testing, by MDE. Well, MDE has a list of about 8 that are drinking water labs. So, and then talks about used by the U.S. EPA. From talking to the analytical chemistry branch over at Fort Meade, which is part of EPA, which is where the permanone and the permacease testing was done. They don't know of any outside labs that EPA uses, per se.
In the entire state or in the entire country?
Country.
Okay, Senator Gallion.
Chair, you mentioned about 12,000 products. Could you just tell us what are some of the kinds of products those would be, and does that include organic pesticides?
Oh, we would have to define what we mean by organic
Right.
pesticides. Technically, every pesticide is organic because it has carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, whatever. If you're talking about the non-EPA regulated ones, which are the 25Bs, those are the exempt ones. And EPA doesn't regulate them, so it's left to the states to do. So it covers a whole gambit of things. Bleach. Some bleaches have an EPA number, and so they're considered a pesticide because they make a claim to kill or mitigate, bacterial or viral issues. Swimming pool chemicals, like your shocks, your chlorinators, those are pesticides. Disinfectants, like what Clorox makes, what Lysol makes in their spray cans. Boat paints. We have several, probably 100, 150 of those because they contain a pesticidal active and they have an EPA number. Your aerosol bombs, like when you bomb your house, if you have fruit flies or bed bugs, that type thing, that's a pesticide. Hospital disinfectants are in that class. So it's a big wide range just other than ag chemicals. And then you have the 25Bs. A lot of manufacturers of 25Bs are small businesses. I mean, we're talking 10, 15 people. And those are registered because they make pesticidal claims on the label. And so they have to be pesticides. And a lot of those I've heard back from, and they will pull their registrations. They won't sell them anymore. And I've also heard that from larger companies, from Bayer, Monsanto, FMC. So they'll take a really good look at the business impact on that. Trying to think of some others. Wipes, disinfectant wipes, that's in that category. There's also patches that you can put on clothing that act as repellents they're in that category. There's water treatment chemicals that are in that category. So it's just, it's a big range.
Yeah, and just a reminder, you know, we have a lot of witnesses signed
Great.
up here, so
Just one more.
Yeah, and then we've got, okay, Senator Brooks, go on, follow up.
Just to follow up on something that Senator Hesker talked about, one thing we're hearing from both sides, there seems to be, there's conflicting information on the issue of validated testing. So is there or is there not a validated testing method for PFAS strictly in pesticides?
No, there's not.
No, there's not.
No, there's not.
Okay, so that was a much quicker question and answer.
Well,
Thank
you have to forgive me. This
Yes.
is my first time.
No, you're doing a wonderful job. Thank you. We appreciate you being here. You know, we have issues come before us, and so you hear two different sides. You're the chemist, and we appreciate
Yeah, I've
having the
been
umpire
down here
here,
to
so to
observe.
speak.
Even when I was a state chemist, I would come down and watch. I did that in Kentucky when I worked for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, just to understand the process.
Well, I could just say, because I see Secretary Designee Addicks, he promised in my office yesterday that his agency will be available post-hearing for questions.
Absolutely.
And so I know that you'll be available to ask questions offline beyond the hearing. Okay, we'll go down the line, and then let's move on to witnesses. We're going to go back to Senator Hester, Carrozza, and then Senator Brooks. You'll have the last word. And again, Mr. Phillips will be available after the hearing and into the future for some questions offline. Senator Hester?
I just, for the benefit of those of us who are new to this committee, I just wondered if you could reflect on the ability of the Secretary of Agriculture to deregister a chemical. Because I know that when we passed, when we were looking at the chlorpyrifos issue,
Yes.
the governor actually wound up banning that and deregistered it, and now it's no longer sold in the state of Maryland. So is there anything in this bill that the Secretary of Agriculture could not do himself?
Do you
Through-
mean as
through-
far as, oh, you mean by regulations? Oh, it could clean up a few things.
Yeah, that might be one, Mr. Secretary Designee, you might get back to us on the authority, specifically Senator Hester's question is kind of, I think, a legal question of sorts, so.
So I'm sorry, was it a registration question or just a regulation question?
Well, I think this issue, what needs to be done statutorily versus what might be within the purview of the agency by regulation to do some things here. So I think that was fundamentally the question. Any additional? Okay, Senator Carrozza, Senator Brooks, and then, okay, we'll fit in Senator Washington.
Thank you. I appreciate the Maryland Department of Agriculture being here, and it sounds like when you saw that this bill was introduced, it looked like to me that there wasn't any advance notice about it, that you could provide information on your end. And I'm reading through some of the, and you probably have not been able to review this yet. I'm looking at the Delaware Maryland Agribusiness Association, and also some of the testimony from those industry constituencies impacted by it. And I know that you haven't probably done a line by line yet, but I noticed that in the Delaware Maryland Agriculture Business Association, they talk about in 2021 lab tests ordered by advocacy organizations claim to find levels of PFAS in pesticides exceeding the EPA interim drinking water standard. Upon further investigation, the test used was EPA method 1633, which is not validated for pesticides. EPA and the Maryland Department of Agriculture submitted samples of the same products to a lab at Fort Meade using the oily matrix method, and EPA released a statement confirming no detection of PFAS contamination in multiple samples. The oily matrix method, however, is not applicable for testing of all pesticides formulations. The testing methodology has to be specific to the substance being tested, so even a validated method for one pesticide would not be applicable to all pesticide formulations, which I think, I read that and I wanted your interpretation that that means that how broad this is, that one test is not going to take care of this, which could, in essence, as I understand the bill, the way it's written, could potentially ban all pesticides from being registered in Maryland.
Okay. There are approximately 14 different types of pesticide formulations. There's emulsifiable concentrate. There's soluble concentrates. Emulsifiable concentrates, you have to agitate a lot to get those to go into solution. Soluble concentrates, they'll just go into water, really, really easily. There's, like I mentioned before, there's aerosol bombs, those that you set off in your home and you leave and you come back. There's ready-to-use sprays. There's just straight liquids. There's solids. And even in mosquito control products, we have approximately, 1,056 Section 3 products that have mosquitoes as a pest on the label. And that covers your off products, your yard sprays to keep the mosquitoes away. The mosquito magnet, that was such a big thing about, 15 years ago. That would be in the attractant and everything in that. That would cover that. Your personal repellents. And they're all formulated different. And from my experience back in the mid-'80s, and even at the department when I started as a bench chemist, there's no two pesticide formulations are the same. If the EPA numbers are different, inerts are different. The actives may be the same level, but the inerts are different. And the inerts are what's causing the problem with just the analytical part of it. So it's a possibility that, companies will not register, not just go through that. It's difficult to survey, an industry in a week's time, to try to get the fiscal note together.
Okay.
It's like
Why don't we do that? I mean, I think you've got the gist of, the answer. So I'd like to move on because we do have a bunch of witnesses here. So Senator Brooks, Senator Washington, then I'd like to go back to some of the panels back and forth, I think would be helpful here at this point. Senator Brooks.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks. Quick question. I'm going to date myself, but this was back in the early 70s. There was a product called DDT. It was a pesticide, and it was banned. Yeah. And I think similarly, there's similar adverse health risks. That is what I see in the PFAS. Could you perhaps speak to that? And then plus, that was a federal ban.
Yeah.
So I wonder, would you speak to that for me?
So you're asking about the health effects?
Yeah, the health effects, and then...
I can't speak to that because I'm not a human toxicologist. Okay. So that's way out of my field.
Okay. But do you see similarities between this being that being a pesticide and also PFAS being pesticides?
Well, PFAS isn't a contaminant unless it's a fluorinated container. And so that would be like, I'm trying to think of a good example. I can't even think of one right off the top of my head.
Okay, Senator Washington.
Thank you, and thank you for helping us walk through this and understand. I just want to return to the bill for a second, and so maybe you can help me understand your comments about tests. So the bill is saying that the secretary can't register a pesticide for use against mosquitoes in our state.
Yep.
Okay. Unless the distributor submits a couple of things, that there are these PFAS test results, and that they've signed an affidavit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So first, I just want to understand, when you said that there are no tests.
No, I said
that's what I'm trying to understand very clearly.
There were no validated tests.
Validated by whom?
Well, a company can do an internal validation, but there's still certain guidelines they have to go by, or should go by.
So I was Googling and researching, and it seems like there are lots and lots of laboratories all over the globe that provide tests for governments and, all kinds of entities, specifically testing for PFAS. So it would seem that the department, that Maryland could find, some test that is good enough to try to protect the health of Marylanders. The second question I was hoping you could help me with is, again, it talks about the distributors. So you made some statements about,
Well, let's
about
do
the sector. So if you could help me understand the distributors of pesticides and the ability of a distributor of a pesticide to acquire a pesticide that is more or less PFAS-free.
Well, let's go to the definition of what distribute means according to the pesticide registration statute. Okay.
And this is
Distribute-
Maryland statute, or is it federal?
Say again?
Is this Maryland statute?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
It's in the agricultural article.
Great, thank you.
I forget what title, but it's there. Distribute means to manufacture. Consign, which means a warehouser, if they're just holding something for somebody, that's being consigned. For sale, barter, all that standard distribute definition. So it could be anybody, per se.
So your concern is with the word distributor for this portion of the, well, not your concern because you're not taking a position, you're just providing information. It's distributor. So if there was a more specific word, manufacture, just some more
Well, I mean,
specific
if-
word, would
yeah.
that be
If we do
more in line?
manufacturer,
Yeah,
that would clear that,
very good.
in
Thank
my
you.
opinion,
Thank
clear
you
that
very
section
much.
up.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, any final question? Seeing none, we're going to now move to, we've got a panel of some favorables, and I'll alternate with some unfavorables, and we'll run the gamut until we're done here. I'm going to call up in the following sequence, signed up favorable, and I'm looking at 5 seats, so 5 people I'm going to call up here. Brett Walls, is Mr. Walls here? Brent Walls, come on up here, Mr. Walls. I've got Rosa Hance, is Ms. Hance here? Next up, Gwen DuBois, Mike Ikniowski, and let's see, we've got one more, Bonnie Raindrop. So is Ms. Raindrop up here? We've got 5 witnesses. Each of you have 2.5 minutes, and we'll just go down the aisle. So we'll start with you, sir, and tell us your name, and then you've got 2.5 minutes, and then we'll just go down to the end of the table.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Brent Walls. I am your Upper Potomac Riverkeeper with Potomac Riverkeeper Network. My organization is in strong support of Bill SB 158 on behalf of our members and communities that depend on clean water for drinking and recreation. The mission of Potomac Riverkeeper Network is to protect the public's right to clean water in the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers and enhance the safety of our drinking water. PFAS is in many commercial products we use every day and indirectly ends up in our wastewater and our groundwater streams. However, PFAS and pesticides is a direct application onto water resources. Since mosquitoes and other insect pests are more of a burden in water-related areas, the exposure of PFAS pesticides is directly impacting the water resources of Maryland that provide drinking water to millions of people. In the past 5 years, I've collected water samples in streams, from wastewater discharges, private wells, and collected fish for PFAS testing. And in every sampling event, I have found PFAS. In September of last year, 113 waterkeepers surveyed 114 waterways across 34 states and D.C., which confirmed the presence of PFAS. In the 20 water samples collected in Maryland from 10 waterkeepers, a total of 134 detections for PFAS was found. One of the highest detections out of all the waterways sampled in this survey, that's across the nation, was Piscataway Creek at 1,264 parts per trillion. So you've already heard from other testifying that the Maryland Department of the Environment had issued a fish consumption advisory. EPA has also done their own testing, and they have found extremely high levels of PFAS in fish tissue up and down the Potomac River. I am currently working with USGS fisheries biologists as they investigate the levels of PFAS in smallmouth bass, one of the most important game fish and source for many subsistence families. The levels of PFAS in the plasma of the smallmouth bass average about 300,000 parts per trillion. There are a number of sources resulting in detection of PFAS, many of which are being assessed by Maryland, but the direct exposure of pesticides with PFAS into our waterways is not being considered, and left unchecked will compound and increase the levels of PFAS in fish tissues and in our drinking water. I urge a favorable report for this bill. Thank you.
Okay, we'll just go down the whole panel before we open up for Q&A, okay? Matt?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Rosa Hance. I'm here to testify in favor of SB 158 on behalf of the 70,000 members and supporters of the Maryland Sierra Club as the chair of the organization. We wanted to communicate our strong support today because PFAS is prevalent. It has been around since the 1940s, and it is, as the senator earlier referred to, just as big of a problem in our environment as DDT was. At this point in time, the rainfall around the entire globe has been tested, and all have PFAS. This is a humongous systemic issue, and one of the most obvious ways in which PFAS can get spread is through literally spraying it in the air, right? So we know that regulations change norms, and I want to thank this committee for the work that you've all done and did just last session in passing the George Walter Taylor Act, which takes a huge chunk out of some of the most high the firefighting foam is very, very rich in PFAS. And I think that this, as others have said, is a natural next step. I've also been, folks have been comparing this to talking about lead in gasoline, right? It took a really long time to get that out of there. And this is our opportunity to do the same with PFAS, get it out of pesticides, get it out of, our air and our water. So it's critical that we protect our vulnerable populations. There are 98 different PFAS regulations throughout 20 states of the union, so there's lots of great examples to choose from. I think this is a fantastic bill, and I want to thank our bill sponsor for such a magnificent presentation, and thank you for your time. I urge a favorable report.
Okay, why don't you hand your mic over to your seatmate there. Tell us your name.
Good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Raindrop. I represent the 112 organizations and businesses that are the Smart on Pesticides Coalition. And I'd like to circle back on some of the questions about testing. So I've been in a lot of meetings with the scientists that are here today, and what we have found for certain is that this testing is readily available. And Dr. Peasley would be a great person to be able to take a question from everyone to be able to explain this in more detail. But in terms of the accessibility of testing, I contacted some of the labs that Department of Environment has certified for testing Maryland drinking water. And one of those is Eurofin's lab. Eurofins has a stellar credential. They have 940 labs around the world, many of them in the United States. The one that's right nearby us, I reached out to them for an estimate. I gave them the exact bill language of what we're wanting to test and wanting to test it for pesticides. Within 3 hours, I had a 15-page documented estimate of how they can do this test, no problem. And our bill sponsor does have a copy of that. So I think that if you guys have any more questions about that, please ask a question directed to Dr. Peasley. He can comment more thoroughly. I also wanted to raise that you might hear about testing that was initially done by advocates who sent a sample of Permanone 3030, a mosquito control product, back in 2020 to Eurofins lab. And there's been some misunderstanding that this was somehow a false positive. And I just want to raise the issue that it was not a false positive, that months later, new samples were provided by the manufacturer, Bayer, and by the Department of Agriculture from different lots from what we originally tested and sent to Eurofins for testing. And so there's always going to be variability from lot to lot in a test like that. So it would have had to have been a split sample going to two different labs at the same time to be able to say that there was ever a false positive on the first Permanone sampling and testing that was done. So I will conclude my remarks there, but just say one last thing, that you all did great work with making sure that we protected pollinators from neonics and chlorpyrifos, and PFAS is a killer of bees. So you have testimony from Central Maryland beekeepers in there about that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Why don't you pull that mic up, sir? Tell us your name, and you've got 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Michael Ikniowski, representing the Maryland chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and speaking today on behalf of Maryland's pediatricians and the many children in their care. PFAS are extremely stable substances that don't readily break down in the environment, as you've heard. Many are poorly excreted by the human body, with half-lives for some measured in years to decades. With this environmental and circulatory persistence, the potential for lifetime exposure and accumulation of PFAS in children is quite substantial. Children and fetuses are uniquely susceptible to the effects of toxic chemicals, a vulnerability that contradicts the commonly held misconception that a dose determines the toxicity of a particular substance. PFAS can cross the placenta and enter the fetal circulation, and prenatal exposure occurring when the brain and other organs are forming can have a lasting impact on children. Infants and young children also have greater exposure to toxic substances in their environment. They breathe more rapidly, they eat and drink large amounts relative to their size compared to adults, and their frequent hand-to-mouth behaviors increase inadvertent non-food ingestion, such as from outdoor soil or contaminated house dust. Children ingesting food or water contaminated by PFAS sprayed on crops or near water sources, and inhaling air contaminated by PFAS recently sprayed in their yards and neighborhoods increases the risk of adverse health effects. Increased PFAS exposure has been found to have immunotoxic effects in children, reducing the antibody response to vaccines, and increasing the risk of infections in children after prenatal exposure. They have also been shown to increase the risk and the severity of COVID infections. PFAS exposure has been linked to low birth weight and decreased length and head circumference in newborns, to an increased risk of congenital and acquired thyroid disease, to increased cholesterol, and to preeclampsia and pregnancy-induced hypertension. Our children deserve to be protected from the harmful effects of unnecessary chemical exposures. Marylanders of all ages deserve to be assured that the mosquito control products and pesticides used in their communities and growing their food are free from PFAS contamination. By passing this legislation, Maryland can take another important step towards protecting its citizens, including our children, from preventable PFAS-related health effects. Because this bill would be expected to reduce children's exposures to PFAS and their potential toxicities, the MDAAP recommends a favorable report on Senate Bill 158. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Why don't you hand that mic on?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
You've got 2.5 minutes.
My name's Dr. Gwen Du Bois. I practiced internal medicine for 35 years in Maryland, and I am a president of Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility. CPSR strongly supports Senate Bill 158. We're a statewide, evidence-based organization of over 940 physicians, medical students, health professionals, and supporters that address the existential public health threats, nuclear weapons, climate crisis, and the issues of pollution and toxic effects on health. By the way, not only my written testimony, but 2 medical students from Hopkins, one who did research on PFAS, have entered written testimony that I would suggest you read. It's really wonderful. We're very concerned about the serious adverse effects of PFAS. The former director of National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences will be speaking here soon, has said publicly that impaired immune response, kidney cancer, and elevated cholesterol in children and adults are caused by PFAS chemicals. In a recent review of evidence from previous studies, the authors concluded, this is to Senator Kagan, with high certainty that they were associated with kidney cancer, testicular cancer, liver damage, associated with fatty liver, altered thyroid hormone levels, high cholesterol, and in adults and children, low birth weight and reduced immune response. But I want to talk a little bit about fatty liver. Non-alcoholic fatty liver is a global epidemic. In the U.S., predictions are that by 2030, it will likely affect 1 out of 3 American adults. Diabetes and obesity are associated with this, but so are these persistent chemicals like PFAS. And they've emerged as another contributor to this epidemic of and liver toxicity. Recent studies confirm that PFAS are associated with liver damage and fatty liver in humans and laboratory animals. The mechanism is not clear yet, and whether factors like obesity interact with PFAS to increase liver damage is also not yet known. With nearly everyone in the modern world having measurable blood levels of PFAS, this should concern all of us. You've heard from Dr. Ikniowski the disturbing link between exposure to PFAS and worse outcome from COVID-19. For all these reasons, Chesapeake PSR strongly supports SB 158. I want to say that our motto is you must prevent what you cannot cure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Any questions for this panel? Okay, thank you. Seeing none, we're going to rotate a little bit. I'm going to call a panel of unfavorables up here. So listen for your name. We've got 5 seats up here. We've got Nicole Sherry. Is Ms. Sherry here? Lindsay Thompson. Holly Porter. Ms. Porter here. Patrick Coakley. And finally, Colby Ferguson. I do see Ms. Ferguson there. So that's our panel of 5. And then after this, we'll go back to some favorables and then continue to rotate. Okay. Why don't we just do the same thing? We're going to start over there, and we're going to go down the list, and everybody's got 2.5 minutes. Everybody here is signed up unfavorable. Go on.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the Senate Education, Energy, and the Environment Committee. For the record, my name is Nicole Sherry, speaking on behalf of the Mid-Atlantic Sports Field Management Association in opposition of Senate Bill 158. I am the immediate past president of the association, and my full-time job is Senior Director of Field Operations for your Baltimore Orioles. Our nonprofit association is comprised of over 220 members skilled in sports field management at every level. We also have members that include turfgrass science researchers and professors. For your consideration, we have also submitted a written letter of opposition against Senate Bill 158. We met with the sponsor of the bill this past Monday, voicing our concerns of this bill. As written, this bill has the potential to eliminate every product my industry uses for our sports fields. I echo my peers' statements and encourage you to give an unfavorable report to this bill. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, we'll hear from the whole panel before we open up for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for having us today. My name is Patrick Coakley. I am the Vice President of the Maryland Turfgrass Council. MTC is a nonprofit organization with over 1,500 active members. The aim of the MTC is to promote the science, technology, professional practice, and improvement of turfgrass production, management, research, and education in the state of Maryland. We are here today to voice opposition to SB 158. The health and safety of the athletes and citizens that benefit from the facilities our members manage is our first priority. If there is a danger, we want to help find a solution. The current bill starts with a very specific chemical application, but quickly expands to every industry in the state. Every tool we have to perform our jobs would be removed either because of the PFAS detection in the materials themselves or the containers they come in. This goes well beyond pesticides and would prohibit fertilizers, drying agents, calcined clay top dressing, and numerous other products that were probably not intended to be affected. This is a drastic move without any plan to replace these tools or delivery system. And this is based upon testing that does not currently exist for pesticides. The Maryland Turfgrass Council has teamed with the Mid-Atlantic Sports Field Managers Association to submit a letter in opposition of this bill. Please reconsider SB 158 for a better plan, and I'm here for any questions that you might have.
Good afternoon. I'm Holly Porter. I'm the Executive Director of the Delmarva Chicken Association, who represents the member trade association representing the chicken growers, the chicken companies, and our allied businesses on Delmarva. And we are here today in opposition of Senate Bill 158. You will hear from others that will talk more specifically about the impact to our grain industry, which is very much our third leg and our three-legged stool of our chicken companies, our chicken farmers, and the grain industry and how important they are. I'm here more importantly to talk a little bit more specifically about something that was mentioned by the state chemist, which is disinfectants, something that are very, very important for our processing plants in particular, because as we know, a safe food supply is absolutely critical, and we need to have certain disinfectants in sanitary forms in order to maintain that. So again, you heard some of the things that were mentioned, such as chlorine bleach, Clorox, Ajax. These are things that not only do we use in our homes, but are also used on commercial levels within our processing plants. So this could have some major impacts to our food safety if, as we have heard, there is not enough of a testing method available, and if these registered pesticides are no longer able to be used within our state, we could have some major consequences. Not only is it important for food safety, but keep in mind, again, these are also things that are worker protection safety as well, too. Hand sanitizers, again, very, very important for all of our workers that we have in our processing plants as well. They were always used before, and it was even more important how sanitation and disinfectants were needed after COVID. So while we recognize the importance of PFAS and we recognize that there is a lot of issues and impacts from PFAS, we also recognize that maybe this bill is possibly getting ahead of the science when it comes to testing, and we ask for an unfavorable remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Colby Ferguson on behalf of Maryland Farm Bureau. And we come in opposition of Senate Bill 158, not in opposition of testing for PFAS or getting rid of PFAS in the state. We absolutely agree with that. And as sometimes we come to find out, being passive users of PFAS, because we don't unknowingly know it's in whether it be a biosolid or whatnot, we don't know that it's there. And so doing those tests are needed in the state. However, we need a test that's accurate and valid, and that's the most important thing. And we heard about the use of the drinking water test. If that was the one that would work, then it would be, we would see EPA basically saying, yes, we'll validate those tests, the 1633 test. So it sounds good that I can go ahead and dilute it with water and make a drinking water test. But when you have fluorinated hydrocarbons that are similar within different classifications of pesticides that have similar natures to the PFAS, they're going to test, sometimes going to pick it up, sometimes not. So is it actually PFAS or is it something else? And so that's the key, and that's why we're waiting on the EPA to finally validate some sort of programs, because the manufacturers, if you put this bill in place, they have to have a test that they get that will be validated by not only the Department of Agriculture but by EPA. And so as of right now, from everything we're being told, that is not out there. We can test it. We can do these tests that way that we use on biosolids and we use on drinking water, but they're not accurate for a jug of pesticides. So with that, we would ask for this to be looked at in the future, particularly when the test, and if the manufacturers still don't want to do it when there's tests available, then maybe it makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, push that to your left.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Lindsay Thompson here today on behalf of the Maryland Grain Producers Association, as well as the Delaware-Maryland Agribusiness Association. I'd like to point out that we're not here to argue about the impacts or the dangers of PFAS. We're also not opposed to testing for PFAS. Senator Elfreth has a bill in Senate Bill 225 to test biosolids for PFAS. Biosolids are also applied to our farm fields and our turf, and we do not oppose that because there is a validated testing method for PFAS in biosolids. The bill cites 1633 or any other validated method by EPA. 1633 is validated for water, soil, biosolids, and tissue. And actually, the Maryland Department of Health Environmental Testing Lab participated in that multi-lab validation. There are no validated tests for pesticides. Sure, you can test a pesticide with one of these other testing methodologies, but that does not mean that it will be accurate. This bill also requires an affidavit be submitted along with the pesticide registration and the test, certifying the validity of that test. How can we expect a registrant to submit a legal affidavit stating that there is no PFAS in their product when it was tested with a testing methodology that is not validated for pesticides? I find it interesting that the proponents say that we should not be waiting for EPA to act on PFAS. EPA does have a strategic roadmap in place to address PFAS contamination in our environment, and the first step in that is research and understanding the science. I find it interesting because the bill refers to an EPA testing standard as well as any other EPA-validated testing method. In the absence of a validated testing method from EPA, this bill requires us to wait for EPA to validate a testing method. This bill threatens access to pesticides, it threatens food production, and it threatens public health because in the absence of a validated testing method, registrants will not be able to meet the provisions of this bill and register pesticides in Maryland. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for this panel? We're going to start with Senator Gallion.
Mr. Chair, question for Ms. Thompson. I saw in your written testimony that EPA were able to test mosquito control pesticides for PFAS. So can that test be used for, why couldn't that test be used for all pesticides?
Sure. So I would first refer you in my written testimony to the statement from EPA about the mosquito control, the Permanone 3030 product, and the results of that testing. EPA utilized at Fort Meade what we call the oily matrix method, which is available for testing of oil-based substances, right? And so while that would be applicable for oil-based pesticides, not all pesticides are oil-based, and therefore it is not applicable across all the classes of pesticides like you heard the state chemists. I think that example really points to what the registrants are concerned about. So one testing method said that there was PFAS, right? Another testing method said that there was not PFAS. Now, we heard the concerns about the difference in different lots, right? Well, this bill would only require the testing of one lot of the pesticides to start with, so it really doesn't solve that issue. But if a registrant has to submit an affidavit of validity, a legal document saying the results are correct, what stops someone from taking a sample of that pesticide, testing it with a different methodology and saying, there's PFAS in this, and then going to the Department of Agriculture and challenging the registration of that pesticide based on their test results? And so in the absence of a validated method, this bill is not able to be implemented.
Okay, we'll go to Senator Lewis Young and then over to Senator Carrozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a somewhat similar question. Is there an EPA-validated test for firefighter foam, rugs, food packaging? And if so, would that be relevant or not? I'm not sure if they're oil-based or not.
So I'm not going to say that I know the answer to your question. I only investigated the 1633 method that was outlined in the bill and reached out to the Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, and EPA to ask the question specific to pesticides, if there's a validated test for pesticides. But I can certainly get an answer to your question and get back to you.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Carrozza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all the panelists and especially Ms. Thompson. You really cleared up a lot of the swirling issues on this, and thank you for all the work you did to present that. I would like to direct my questions to Ms. Porter, Delmarva Chicken Association, and I have two questions. One is kind of a broader, and one's to follow up on your testimony on disinfectants. My first question is, I'd like to know, how are pesticides integral to the meat chicken industry, And how would the industry be affected if they were suddenly to become unavailable, was my first question. And then on the disinfectants, I want to better understand that. Are there currently any commercial disinfectants on the market that would not be affected or, I guess, banned by this legislation as written?
Sure. So I'll answer your second question first, if I may, in the sense that I am not aware of any, and I would not be the expert to know that, but I'm not aware of any commercial disinfectants that wouldn't have to be required to be registered as pesticides in the state if we were utilizing those. So that might be a question that the Department of Ag may know better. But as far as I'm aware, any of our commercial products that we're using would have to be registered in order for us to be using them in the state, and I'm not aware of any that wouldn't fall under that category. As for the first question, so, again, as I mentioned earlier, we often talk about our three-legged stool. So our chicken economy on Delmarva is about a $4.7 billion GDP. So pretty important to those of us over on the Delmarva and on the eastern shore of Maryland. And so we rely on the grain farmers to feed our chickens. The grain farmers, meaning that we need to grow corn, soybeans. The grain farmers need to utilize pesticides depending on, what crop they're growing. But we need pesticides in order to basically help grow the crops that are going to feed the chickens. We also use pesticides on our chicken farms as well, too. We want to make sure that there's no insecticides. This is very important for the health of the birds, as well as for the cleanliness, things like salmonella, things of those issue. So it's important on our chicken farms. And then ultimately, as I mentioned, within our processing plants and harvesting plants, disinfectants, sanitary, all of those things are absolutely the utmost importance. And we're inspected, USDA inspected. We have to meet certain criteria. We don't want salmonella, E. coli, any of those things that are really, really bad to be in our food supply in our chicken industry. So it's really three-pronged in how this would have a major impact.
Okay, I don't see any additional questions. Thank you to the panel for your testimony. We've got one more in-person favorable panel, and I'm going to call those witnesses. Then we have a few virtual witnesses to round things out. So the following panel, we've got, again, 5 seats, 5 witnesses left here. Matt Stegman, Laura Stewart, Sean Lynch, Jason Davidson, and finally, Virginia Ruiz. And that's the in-person, and then after you guys, we've got 2 favorable virtual, 2 unfavorable virtual, and then we'll be done with the testimony. So, Mr. Stegman, why don't you lead off, and we'll go down.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt Stegman on behalf of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. We're here in favor of this bill. Most of the points that I was going to make have already been covered, so I understand it's been a very long day. Would just say to all of the other proponent testimony, me too.
Does he get points for that?
Yes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Feldman, Madam Vice Chair Kagan. I'm Laura Stewart with Free State PTA, also representing the Maryland Education Coalition and the Montgomery County PTA's Health and Wellness Committee. Free State PTA represents 50,000 volunteers in over 500 public schools. One of our principles, our founding principles, is to promote the safety and well-being of all children. SB 158 reduces the harm that pesticides already present to children by requiring that pesticides be tested for PFAS and free of PFAS. Pesticides are used in Maryland schools on a regular basis, inside the building and on play areas and fields outside the building. IPM laws were passed 25 years ago in order to protect children at school from undue exposure to pesticides, but we've heard from parents that some school systems do not attempt to appropriately reduce the use of pesticides. MCCPTA Health and Wellness Committee has asked for an update in the IPM law to be more protective. As a parent who has a child in an older has had a child at an older facility, we frequently receive notice of pesticide use. Adding PFAS to that harm is doing even more damage to children, which you have already heard from the experts here. We need to reduce PFAS exposure to our children in and out of school. Testing and eliminating these chemicals from pesticides will reduce that harm to children. Therefore, Free State PTA urges a favorable report for SB 158. And if I still have a minute or so, I want to point out that Clorox wipes, et cetera, had been brought up in this meeting, and registered pesticides used in the school building. Would it be a bad thing if we knew those were PFAS-free to protect children inside the building? I don't see the problem in that. Personally, I don't want my kids or other kids being exposed to PFAS when it doesn't need to happen. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Madam Vice Chair, and members of the committee. I'm Sean Lynch, Environmental Research and Partnership Manager for representing Mom's Organic Market. 10 of our 22 stores are located in Maryland and serving thousands of Marylanders daily. Our customers demonstrate their concern about pesticide exposure and toxins in the environment by choosing organic. In addition to advocating for regulation of pesticides and PFAS, we considered our responsibility to educate our consumers, many of whom are mothers of children, about the harms of these substances. PFAS are still a relatively obscure topic to the average citizen, and this has helped manufacturers fly under the radar. Mom strongly supports SB 158. Given our 22 stores and our dedication to healthy organic food, we have great concern about the discovery of PFAS in food grown in fields with commonly used pesticides containing PFAS. This is an alarming, almost unimaginable public health threat, similar to when DDT, lead paint, and the ozone layer, and CFCs were found to have overwhelming harm on wildlife, our children, and the ozone layer. Yet by our leaders taking concrete steps to eliminate these threats, what was once perceived as insurmountable became achievable. Positive reports on the repair of our ozone layer is a recent example of what we need to do to turn off the tap of PFAS and pesticides, which is contaminating our food and the world we give our children and grandchildren. And even of greatest concern is the lack of research on synergistic impacts of these two toxic classes of chemicals. Mom's purpose is to protect and restore the environment. This bill is part of the work that we have been passionate about for years and will continue to advocate for. Now is the time to regulate pesticides and PFAS. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Jason Davidson. I represent Friends of the Earth, a national environmental advocacy organization that is part of the largest grassroots environmental federation globally, represented in more than 70 countries. And we are in favor of SB 158. To avoid being too duplicative, I'll focus mainly on what EPA has recently done or failed to do on PFAS. So late in 2022, in December, EPA banned 12 PFAS chemicals for use as inert ingredients in pesticides. And as you've heard previously, one of the challenges here is, given that we do not know what is used as inert ingredients in pesticides, we do not know what percentage of PFAS chemicals used as inert ingredients that represents. We really have no idea what portion of the problem that fixes, as well as it, of course, does not address unintentional contamination of pesticides through things like PFAS use in the plastics in the containers. And so this is one way that Maryland can step up to fill in that gap, since clearly we recognize that PFAS contamination is a problem, but do not currently have the tools, especially as members of the public, to really identify how far along EPA is in addressing that problem, and certainly testing individual products for use in Maryland would go a long way in that respect. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Virginia Ruiz, and I am here today on behalf of Marylanders for Food and Farm Worker Protection, which is a broad coalition of labor experts and organizations, including those working directly with poultry workers, crab pickers, and field workers in Maryland. We advocate to improve health and safety rights and protections for these essential workers in Maryland. And SB 158 will provide much-needed health and safety protections for these vulnerable communities. Maryland is home to thousands of essential workers in the agricultural and food processing industries who are predominantly people of color. Most are either immigrants or foreign workers who are working here on temporary work visas. They work long hours in hazardous conditions for very low pay. We rely on them to provide meat, fruits and vegetables that are vital to our food supply and to Maryland's economy, including watermelons, tomatoes, crab meat, and poultry. Maryland's farm workers, poultry, and seafood workers are important members of our communities, and yet these underserved populations lack some of the most basic health and safety protections, in addition to a lack of access to preventive care, medical assistance, and health insurance. Agricultural pesticides pose great risks in themselves to human health and the environment, and food and farm workers are routinely exposed to high levels of pesticides in the fields where they work, in the disinfectants used in the food processing plants, and in the environments where they live. Pesticide exposure causes these workers to suffer more chemical-related injuries and illnesses than any other workforce, and each year thousands of food and farm workers experience the effects of acute pesticide poisoning, including headaches, nausea, shortness of breath, seizures, while others experience some long-term impacts associated with pesticide exposure, such as cancers, neurological ailments, and reproductive disorders. The alarmingly high levels of PFAS found in pesticides that are commonly used in Maryland is especially concerning for all citizens, but especially for the already overburdened communities who live and work on the front lines of pesticide applications. SB 158 provides a common sense approach to eliminating PFAS contamination for farm workers, and Marylanders for Food and Farm Worker Protection urges you to support passage of SB 158. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for any of the panelists? Okay, seeing none, thank you for your testimony. We have 2 witnesses virtual favorable and 2 witnesses virtual unfavorable. So we're going to start with Hardy Kern, who hopefully will be zooming in, signed up favorable. Hardy Kern?
Yes, I'm here. Hello. Starting my video.
Okay, Mr. Kern, you've got 2.5 minutes. You're signed up favorable.
Thank you. Yes, I did sign up favorably. My name is Hardy Kern. I'm the Director of Government Relations for American Bird Conservancy. We strongly support SB 158 and American Bird Conservancy. We work internationally and nationally to conserve birds across the Americas. Our expertise is in bird conservation and habitat restoration across a wide variety of issues, as evidenced by the reference to our work on collisions in the previous bill hearing. And in addition to all of the fantastic points that have been made, which we would like to echo and support, I would really like to talk about the effects that PFAS have on shorebirds and all the other waterfowl and bird life that call Maryland home. In particular, plovers, willets, and gulls, which frequent the coast, may be at risk from loss of prey species. Ruddy ducks, hooded mergansers, and even the omnipresent, everybody's favorite, the mallard duck, may all be at risk from things like organ failure after ingesting invertebrates or fish, which are contaminated with PFAS. PFAS are known to bioaccumulate in aquatic invertebrates, and they're both acutely and chronically toxic to both invertebrates and to the species that consume them. A study was done in Massachusetts a few years ago, and it was found that out of 36 seabirds that were surveyed, they had their livers dissected, 100% of them had elevated levels of PFAS. This was the first time this had ever been documented, and it wasn't even the goal of the study to look for PFAS. It was just something that jumped out to the researchers while they were surveying. And my background on the call today is one of America's most treasured birds, and that's the red knot. It's a shoreline wading bird. They migrate through Maryland every year. They draw thousands of people to the coast, and they feed on the eggs of the horseshoe crab. Horseshoe crabs are acutely affected by PFAS. It's very, very deadly to them. And when we're talking about effects on birds, it goes further than just being an environmental concern. This also has to do with economic well-being. Over $41 billion is contributed annually to the United States economy just from watching and feeding birds, but dialing it down into Maryland, an estimated 900,000 residents and non-residents enjoy birds. ABC has over 8,000 supporters in Maryland alone. And again, we strongly support this legislation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kern. Any questions for Mr. Kern? Okay, seeing none. Our other favorable signed-up witness virtual is Linda Birnbaum. Ms. Birnbaum, are you on the line? Linda Birnbaum, there you go. Ms. Birnbaum, can you, you've got to unmute yourself. You're on mute.
Okay, I think you cannot because the host has disabled it. Okay.
Okay, you're good. You've got 2.5 minutes.
Very good, thank you. My name is Linda Birnbaum, and I am a scientist emeritus at the National Institutes of Health and the former director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program. Before spending 11 years as the director of NIEHS and NTP, I was the director of the largest health research division at US EPA, and I have actually been studying PFAS since the 1980s. PFAS are a huge class of chemicals. There are more than 12,000 of them according to EPA's Office of Research and Development. And I think the important thing is they are everywhere and we are all exposed. The problems with PFAS are that they are so persistent in the environment that they're called forever compounds because they do not break down in the environment, and they are extremely difficult to break down in any other way. They are highly mobile, so they move. They're not where they're necessarily produced or used. And many of the PFAS are highly bioaccumulative in our own bodies as well as that of wildlife. And many of them, although not many have been tested, those that have been are all toxic and cause a related spectrum of effects. In fact, they affect pretty much every organ system in our body at some stage of our development or adulthood, for example. So I think you've already heard about their effects on cancer, their effects on liver and kidney toxicity, effects on the immune system, not only suppression of the ability to mount a vaccination response, but an increase in autoimmunity, associations with preterm birth, low birth weight, diabetes, and endocrine disruption, not only effects on the thyroid gland, but effects on our estrogen and androgen systems as well. Again, they cause harm throughout the body, and there's no easy way to get rid of them. Many of us have been concerned about PFAS for years, and you might want to look at my written testimony for that. We know that the producers knew that there was a problem, but that didn't stop them from continuing to make them. And we clearly need to turn off the tap. Now, there's no way that we can test for all 12,000 PFAS, but we can test for total organic fluorine. This is a very important screening approach because, in fact, if you do the TOF test and you find there is no TOF, then you know that there is no PFAS. And there are tests for specific PFAS that can be used, and the TOF tests can be used for pesticides as well as many other sources. We know that PFAS are those that are not essential, we should not use. And if they are essential, we need to continue to look for safe alternatives. Because the federal state is so slow,
Ms.
EPA is so
Ms.
slow.
Birnbaum, you blew past your 2.5 minutes. If you could maybe wrap up at this point, thank you.
I'm on my last point. Because federal EPA is so slow, the states are moving ahead. I congratulate Maryland on already what it's done in the regulation of PFAS and other chemicals and in pesticides. PFAS are not needed in pesticides, either as inert or actual agreements. So I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you. Any questions for Senator Lewis Young?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Birnbaum, for your testimony. Do you think it's likely that the EPA will issue a validated test?
I think this is a misunderstanding. EPA will not issue a validated test because they believe that the existing ways that you can measure it using some of their methods, as well as the methods that are used commercially by organizations like Eurofins, are perfectly adequate.
Thank you.
Okay, any additional questions? Okay, seeing none, we've got two witnesses virtual unfavorable. First is Megan Provost there you go. Ms. Provost, you are signed up unfavorable, and you've got 2.5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify on SB 158. My name is Megan Provost, and I'm president of RISE, the National Trade Association representing manufacturers, formulators, and distributors of specialty pesticides. We respectfully oppose this legislation as it is unnecessary with existing federal regulation of pesticides, as a test method cannot adequately test for the presence of PFAS in pesticides, and as it will disadvantage Maryland residents with no protections from pests and invasive species. SB 158 is not necessary as all pesticides, including those formulated with fluorinated chemistry, must be registered by EPA prior to applying for and receiving state registration in Maryland. To approve a new pesticide, EPA must determine that when used in accordance with the label, it will not cause unreasonable adverse effects on the environment and does provide a reasonable certainty of no harm to human health. EPA must periodically review registered pesticides to ensure they continue to meet this robust safety standard. Pesticides are unique, with more scientific data available about them than for any other products available in commerce today. The test methods suggested in the bill cannot adequately test for the presence of PFAS in pesticides. As we've heard today, this is EPA's PFAS test method for water, not pesticides. EPA has only one validated method for the detection of PFAS compounds in oily matrices, such as pesticides. It is important to note that when this validated test method was used, PFAS that was previously detected with other methods were not found in the samples. And SB 158 will disadvantage Maryland residents as they will likely lose access to critical products. Pesticides provide vital protections against harmful, invasive, and non-native species like insects, rodents, and weeds that can threaten the health and well-being of communities. Relying on the rigorous testing already done by EPA would ensure that Maryland residents have access to pesticides for their own critical uses. Thank you for the opportunity to provide our perspective on SB 158. We urge you to vote no.
Okay, any questions for Ms. Provost? Okay, we've got a question from Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question. Since you're kind of dealing more at the federal level, we talk about a lot of state stuff here. Is there a requirement by EPA to test for PFAS in any other state, or would Maryland be the very first one?
Maryland would be the first with any testing requirements to register pesticides in the state.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any additional questions? Okay, seeing none, we have one final witness for today, unfavorable, Anastasia Swearingen. Ms. Swearingen, you got to unmute yourself, I think, and there you go. And you are the final witness of this tip for today, and you've got 2.5 minutes.
Thanks. It's a lot of pressure to be quick as the final witness. Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Anastasia Swearingen, the Executive Director of the American Chemistry Council Center for Biocide Chemistries. So we represent manufacturers of antimicrobial pesticides, including preservatives, disinfectants, water treatment chemicals, industrial biocides, and antifoulant paints. So you've heard from some of the users of these products today about how critical these are for protecting public health, as well as the additional benefits of increasing sustainability of everyday products, construction materials, preventing contamination in industrial processes. I just want to echo that ACC CBC is opposed to this legislation as it's drafted. As Ms. Provost noted, registrants submit significant amount of data to EPA and state pesticide regulatory authorities already. We must disclose all of our ingredients in our formulation, including the inert ingredients that require approval by EPA for use in pesticides. These important reviews by EPA and the states help ensure that the antimicrobial products on the market in Maryland and across the U.S. are safe to use as directed. We echo the concerns about the test methods. Antimicrobial products come in a variety of forms, from wipes, granules, solids, liquids. Drinking water and the oily matrices test is not the same as testing for these products. We know that the proposed PFAS levels are extremely low, and the affidavit issues, as mentioned before, would be extremely problematic for registrants. We want to be sure that those tests are accurate, and we have concerns about the ability to challenge a registration later on. We note that the presence of fluorine is not necessarily indicative of the presence of PFAS and would not be an appropriate test standard. We just note, too, that this is going to be a big burden, especially on the small businesses with a few products registered in Maryland, and that for many of those, they may pool their registrations rather than have an annual testing burden. We're not aware of any other state where there is an annual testing requirement to maintain your registration, and for those smaller companies, it may not be worth it to have the Maryland market. For larger companies, they may reduce the variety of the antimicrobial products that are registered and sold in Maryland. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for the witness? Okay, seeing none, thank you. And that concludes the bill hearing on, what's our bill number? What is our bill number? 158, that's it. Folks, if you can, we need about 5 minutes on the computer, and if you come back, the last act of the week for work will be, because we're not in tomorrow, we're not on Monday, is I'd like to knock out just a few quick bills. There's a couple withdrawals, a few bills, and then we'll be done. So in 5 minutes, be here in your seat, and we'll work quick, and then we'll be done for the week.